get homeless children off the streets and back into houses where homes, undestroyed homes where they belong? How are we going to get back to work? What are we should understand now why all the consequences we are suffering. We are suffering from this obfuscation of the currency. So this political history is actually very important. So the Reagan people and I have occasional talks, and sometimes 1983 they asked me, well, how far off into the future do you think this economy is going to fail? And we were suffering double-digit prime rates at the time, which really escalate to failure. And a credible mathematician does not make careless statements as if they are answers. And I entertained the question myself, of course, but in order to explore the answer to that question, you have to do a tremendous amount of reiterative math, which isn't conducive to manual methods. And it actually would take quite a while for a person, even who was understanding of the issues as I was, to conceive of just how to write a computer model, which would account for any question of aberration or anything, which let's say deficiency would lend to a conclusion which was not credible. In other words, you need to develop not just a process of approximating or something like that. You have to come up with a very accountable process. And I actually had an exacting idea of how to do that when the Reagan administration asked me. They asked me if I thought I could develop some way of determining when the economy would crash. And my first impression, I should mention, is that was a betrayal of extremely subversive motives, because here they were sitting on a proof that we would accumulate debt at an inherently escalating rate, especially under those extremely high rates of interest at the time. And yet, while they had not a word even to disprove this proof of inevitable failure and singular solution, instead they're asking me how far off the failure is going to be, as if, well, maybe if we can survive it while we're sitting president, we'll just persist in this lie of economy for the guys who put me in office, or whatever the reason is. I'm not offered a reason, of course, so you can only speculate. Well, I didn't want to make myself an outsider by challenging, but I'm not going to play a condescending role in whatever interaction goes on either. So I tell them exactly how we would develop such models, and that is, we would start at the beginning circulation, and you would tell me how much you're going to allow the circulation to grow. And what we would do is we would borrow that money into circulation on top of the existing circulation, accumulating that much additional debt. Growth is always additional debt, and that being subject to whatever rates of interest at the time. And we would the rest of the circulation, we would, we out of that total circulation, rather, we would be paying the principal and interest in any given period of time, and we borrow the principal back as new debt equal to the old, and we borrow the interest back as new debt above the former sum of debt, thus accumulating sum of debt until we reached a point where the entire circulation would be dedicated to servicing debt, and we could call that the maximum possible lifespan of any so-called economy based on interest-bearing debt. But of course, that possible lifespan isn't even theoretically possible, because there are some costs of sustaining whatever industry needs to be preserved, which is sufficient to continue servicing the debt. So we actually have a point in time which is short of that, which I call the maximum practical lifespan of any economy based on interest-bearing debt, where the where the multiplication of artificial indebtedness infringes on the minimal industry which continues servicing that debt, and that's the furthest you can get without precipitating failure. So I said, in order to do this model, you're going to have to provide me with figures off into the future. So I need to know how you're going to determine interest rates. And I was met with silence. They hadn't the slightest idea what to do. I'd already proven that that they have to lower interest rates, but how much? They had no way of they barely got it, much less had they prepared to determine how. And so I told them, well, after re-explaining that they're going to have to reduce rates, in fact, at an ever-escalating rate, and eventually even zero rates of interest won't save you from the failure, because you can't even afford to pay the principal out of circulation, and so much principal will be subject to interest even when the prime rates are zero. So anyway. What I recommended that I do is that I develop some logic which would, as we skimmed across or close to the edge of failure, would reduce interest rates enough to persist a while longer, anticipating that would be the very behavior of the Federal Reserve as I had already experienced it. And so I incorporated that logic, ratcheting down interest rates. And when you look at the models, I ran them for hundreds of scenarios, and picked out the most likely de-escalation of interest rates. And what do you know? If you examine the patterns of data that those models generated, it's uncanny that they so accurately projected the accumulation of debt of this country. In fact, I ran the models and I told Reagan, if he does 2 terms, he's going to triple the national debt. How do you like that? And they went on anyway. So, yep. But anyway, the numbers I ran in 83 and 84 projected that this live economy would reach its maximum practical lifespan at approximately 2010 AD. And so there you have it. So what's happened is, we have several generations spanning this, second lifespan of the so-called Federal Reserve System, which is a private set of banks. We always have to remember that. And banks are not just banks. There's the central banks, there's peripheral banks. The central banks are the creators of this obfuscated currency. So, we have several generations. The first generation, can acquire all the land, at minuscule, relatively minuscule prices, and turn it over again and again and again, and make profit, unbelievable profit from its own progeny. And in the end, while they haven't, if they had serviced the debt that's accumulated over their lifespans, basically did the math when you account for the derivative scandals, which have been instrumental in maintaining the false prices of securities and all the purchases of federal financial instruments by the Federal Reserve to falsely buoy up the securities markets, from which this first generation largely benefits. The person of average age of this of 80 in this country, and I did the math on this several years ago, the way it comes out is accounting for the debt that's accumulated for their generation from much earlier in time, while they've realized more prosperity than we have for effort, education, and so on. They nonetheless, if you account for the costs that they've heaped on their own progeny and posterity, it affects the average net worth of a person of the age of 80 to the effect of negative $17 million per capita. So this is the price of the falsified prosperity of the retained prosperity of the first generation. I'm not faulting them entirely for this. Of course, it's a matter that all generations have to resolve. As Thomas Jefferson wrote some very profound things about, an existing generation having no right whatsoever to leave its debts to further generations. And he was just so foresightful in so many ways. But anyway, the thing is, that generation is likewise paid a tremendous penalty from what prosperity they would have realized if they had under mathematically perfected economy. And why I'm interjecting this right now is not a matter of condemning one generation over another. I am raising the point that we need to grow up, and we have to realize that just generations don't persist in those injustices upon further generations. That is, my generation is heaping a like injustice on its own progeny, and the youngest generations today haven't a chance to have the America that was intended by the founders and those who spilled blood to create this country that they intended to give to us. Now, the thing is then, what we have to understand is that there is a way to sustain the oldest generations by relieving them of the consequences of the debt that they are leaving us if they simply wanted to persist in this lie of economy imposing these debts upon us. There is a way to resolve these debts, and it seems it is mathematically perfected. It's mathematically impossible within the existent system, but it is entirely plausible and legally achievable instantly in a transition to mathematically perfected economy. And I've more or less detailed this in a paper which I call If I Were President. To read that paper, you have to understand the political ramifications of what we're challenged with here. We have a government, I can't tell you, how many times practically every candidate from, Mitt Romney to Ron Paul to Sarah Palin to John McCain, to Barack Obama, I actually have a proposition of mathematically perfected economy, which the Obama campaign requested from me to be sent to Chicago offices. Okay, certified delivery return receipt requested. It was returned without even opening it. Can you imagine that?
That's hard to believe.
Well, I can touch it within a few seconds. And it's still sealed, and it will remain that way. The thing is, and you have to understand how this history is. Dennis Kucinich has just introduced a so-called need bill. Well, this is a farce. It doesn't solve anything, but it's a plagiarism of my work by one of my most blatant plagiarists, Stephen Zarlinga of the so-called American Monetary Institute. Now, he's borrowing my language, he's borrowing all kinds of things, but he's not accomplishing the purposes.